Okay, folks, so how do you analyze a film? There are going to be 4 things that I want you to keep in mind. The first are the creative choices of the person who's making the film. The second is going to be the cultural context. The third is going to be the socio-political impact. And the fourth is going to be the emotional and embodied impact. Okay, so these are the 4 factors, all right? So let's go into creative choices. When we're talking about the creative choices that a author or a creator in this case is making, think about it as sort of like a palette of decisions, right? So one of those things is going to end up being something like, filming technique, right? And this includes a lot of things. It includes sound. So here we're talking about things like sound effects. We're thinking about things like the sort of chorus or like the chatter in the background. We're thinking about like a musical score. We're thinking about volume. And we're also thinking about things like silence, right? So that's part of film technique, right? But we're also thinking about things like color, right? All right, so we're thinking about things like, is there color being used in terms of a theme? Are we talking about things like saturation? Remember that saturation can go up and down to make things really muted. We can also be talking about like a palette of colors that are used and how that creates a mood. We could also be talking about things like the hue or the tint, right? So all of those things also matter, right? In addition to that, film technique also includes shot composition. And shot composition includes things like whether we're doing a close-up, whether we are panning out, whether something is in the background or the foreground, right? All of those things. Whether something is zoomed in, whether something is in or out of frame. So all of those things also matter, okay? And then finally, too, and you know this from the Blazer piece, there's also just like world building, right? So world building is kind of like the physical logics of the place, also like the social logics of a place. All of those things matter as well, okay? So that right there is film technique, all right? But we're also thinking about things like character build, all right? So in character build, there are going to be some other things that are going to end up being relevant in terms of character build. So in character build, we are talking about things like how the character is voice acted. Is the person voice acting them famous or known? What is the pitch and the tone of the person who is speaking? Also sort of the volume. All of those things that would kind of indicate some kind of personality. In addition, we're talking about things like how the character is illustrated. And here we're going to be talking about things like gender expression, so clothes, hair, makeup, accessories, etc., right? We're also talking about, race and ethnicity. We're talking about things like body size and stature. All right. And we might also be talking about things like, well, I don't know, that's pretty good there, right? Also, in terms of character build, we're also thinking about descriptions, right? So, how do other characters describe this character? How does that character describe themselves, right? And then in addition to that, we're also talking about things like action, right? And here we're thinking about things like movement. We're thinking about things like agency in terms of who does what. We're thinking about things like gestures. We're thinking about things like facial expressions. So all of those things go into a character build, okay? But in addition to that, we might also be thinking about some other things, right? So let's get into that. So in addition to character build, we might also be talking about something like plot. All right, so in plot, we're talking about the character's choices. We're talking about how other people treat that character. We're thinking about the character's ultimate fate. And we're also thinking about things like whether or not something is resolved or unresolved in terms of the plot, which, obviously becomes kind of important, right? So that's plot. And then finally, we're also going to be talking about something else, which is, speaking, right? So here's what I mean by things that are spoken, all right? So when we're talking about speaking, we are talking about things like who gets to speak, who's silent. We also are thinking about things like point of view. And we're thinking about things like narration. Is there someone who is doing the work of narrating? And then also things like dialogue, right? And then what gets left said and then also unsaid, right? What's left implied. So all of those things also kind of factor in when we are talking about the creative choices that an creator is making in their film. And so when we're analyzing those types of things, this bit right here is going to get you really, this is really about analyzing the film, okay? And when you're analyzing the film, the idea here is that it's not just enough to say it, you have to be able to find examples to support whatever it is, whatever kind of meaning that you're making, and you're going to want to explain why those examples are relevant. All right, so that is creative choices. In addition to that, the other thing that becomes really, really important is cultural context, okay? So when we're talking about cultural context, really what we're asking about is sort of like the larger, how this story fits into other stories. All right, so how does this relate to a sort of ecosystem of other stories? And then in terms of that, are we talking about, for example, is the way that they are, say, representing disability, does it kind of relate to a kind of status quo, right? Are they forwarding messaging that is, potentially oppressive? Or in relation to that, could it be something that is stereotypical? Could it be something that is a reductive archetype, right? Like the sad, lonely character with no friends because they have a disability. Or in addition to that, could the person be doing something, could the creators be doing something that really kind of expands, storytelling in a way that kind of increases our understanding of, that particular social group being valued, right? And so forth. And then, sometimes too, you get situations where we're talking about someone who tries to do something maybe potentially expansive, but really kind of ends up dropping the ball in the end, right? So all of those things kind of get at this larger cultural context. And remember that the key here is how this kind of relates to other stories, all right? So when we're talking about this, all right, when we're talking about this stuff right here, what we're doing is we are comparing, right, this to a sort of larger ecosystem. And so to do that, we might be looking at, for instance, academic articles. We might be looking at things like reviews of the film, right? And then you're also going to be relying on your own cultural knowledge. Okay, so that is two of the factors here. All right, the next is socio-political impact. So what do we mean when we're talking about socio-political impact? This kind of gets at this idea of so what? So this is kind of asking you to be a bit of a philosopher, and the idea is, what kind of world does this story get us? And how does that, for instance, produce a world in which we are either increasing or decreasing our cultural value? So how does the way that disability, for instance, is represented, how does that communicate the cultural value of people who are disabled based upon what that storytelling looks like? And then related to that, how might the impact of this film influence things like larger systems? So stuff like how resources are allocated or withheld, right? Because if we, for instance, think that people with disabilities don't have any kind of agency, then obviously that's going to influence kind of larger systems of how folks get, treated at a systemic level. And then in relation to that, we should also talk about the emotional and embodied impact of, the storytelling, right? So this is, again, your sort of philosopher hat right here, and we're asking again this question of so what. But here we're getting at a personal level, right? How does this film inspire people to treat other people, right? And then in relation to that, how does this film influence the ways that people see themselves? And this is particularly important, right? If we're talking about a marginalized group of people, right? Because we might be thinking, well, gee, people with disabilities are represented as being lonely and not being leaders is obviously going to influence self-esteem, but it's also going to influence how people, how people treat other folks as well, right? So again, these last two right here, I want you to think about these last two as just kind of getting at the conclusion of your paper. And certainly you are going to be able to rely on, again, things like academic articles, and certainly maybe some of the reviews of films might mention these types of things. But again, you're also relying on your cultural knowledge. But what I really want you to keep in mind is that the big ones, I think, are looking at the creative choices, because that really requires you to engage with the text, and you're not summarizing, you're saying, what choices is this creator making, and then again, what are the sort of, how does that measure up to what a larger system of storytelling does? And then in 3 and 4, we're talking about like, what are the impact of those choices, right? So that is how you analyze a film.